You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on January 29th, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. Last week, we discussed bringing a conscious awareness to our thoughts in order to combat the normal tendency that each of us have to meet new moments in our lives with mistrust, fear, judgmentalism, and a spirit of dismissal. In some sense, the invitation was to do a contemplative inquiry of our persistent thoughts for the sake of transcending our foregone conclusions about the stories we tell ourselves so that we might return to a posture of awe, wonder, and surrender. So that rather than us bringing some new judgment to the moment, we allow the moment to do its work on us and can enter the second naïveté, which is an attunement to the mystical realization of our presence, just witnessing every moment as it comes and passes. We could call this crossing the threshold of thought into the second naïveté. One thing I forgot to mention was a favorite quote of mine from Thomas Merton, who said that if we could let go of our obsession with what we think is the meaning of it all, we might be able to hear God's call and follow God in God's mysterious cosmic dance. For the world and time are the dance of the Lord in emptiness. The silence of the spheres is actually the music of a wedding feast. The more we persist in misunderstanding the phenomena of life, the more we analyze them out into strange finalities and complex purposes of our own, the more we end up involving ourselves in sadness, absurdity, and despair. But it doesn't matter much because no despair of ours can alter the reality of things or stain the joy of the cosmic dance which is always there. Indeed, we are in the midst of it, and it is in the midst of us, for it beats in our very blood, whether we want it to or not. Yet the fact remains that we are invited to forget ourselves on purpose, cast our awful solemnity to the winds, and join in this general dance. So what Merton is teaching us here is that when we get into the game of analysis, of taking the thoughts that come across our awareness and weaving them into storylines that may or may not be true, by the way, we often get ourselves wrapped up in sadness, absurdity, and despair, because we can easily end up living into these false stories we're telling ourselves rather than being present and open in the moment. But underneath these thoughts, he says, is the silent dance of reality just happening, It beats in our blood. And if we could release our obsessive attempts at making meaning of everything, we may be able to surrender once again to the awe and wonder of existence. Again, this whole series is looking at the second naïveté, which is what emerges only when we've tried so hard to make meaning a million times over, only to run into the dead ends of sadness and despair. That is when another way is invited of us. So this same contemplative tool of releasing our thoughts and surrendering to the moment can be applied to our emotions as well. That is what the conversation's about tonight. So let me try to give you a practical example of what Merton is talking about here as it applies to emotion. When I was young, I would cry fairly easily when I got frustrated, especially in elementary school when I played sports. And some of the kids, some of my classmates recognized this and would egg me on while we were playing soccer or baseball, knowing they could, in essence, frustrate me to the point to make me cry fairly easily, and it was a good laugh for them. I still remember the day I got frustrated at baseball practice, and my coach, who was used to me crying, said, "Tim, you should really try yelling instead of crying." Because as we all know, there's no crying in baseball. So the next time I got frustrated with something, what did I do? I yelled. Now, that didn't necessarily keep me from crying, in the future when I felt my frustration. But it did teach me a mechanism that sort of stuck with me into my adult life. Instead of going into your sadness, go straight to anger. You know, Richard Rohr has a new book out that's called The Tears of Things. And in it, he says, I have become convinced that most anger comes, first of all, from a place of sadness. So I share this with you to say this. As an adult, when I began to deal with my anxiety for the first time, part of my process of excavating what was really going on was to really turn toward the sadness I'd been carrying that went underground beneath my anger. And for a season, I wept what felt like every day. I mean, like for months and months and months on end. And, you know, it wasn't every day, but it was just a season of the soul, you know, where I was metabolizing some difficult emotions for a long time. And let me tell you, when you are really in your emotions like that, it can feel like you have tunnel vision. You know, all you can see is your sadness, right? And sometimes this is a necessary part of the grief process, you know, moving through the throes of sadness. But what it feels like in the moment is that I have become my sadness. It's more than I am sad. It's, I guess, sadness is my life now. And that jump is the one we're trying to overcome, over-identifying with our emotions. So my point in telling you this is when we move from feeling our emotions into making an identity statement out of them, we've gone too far. This is what Merton is talking about when he says, if we analyze even our feelings out into conclusions about ourselves other than that we are the beloved of God experiencing strong emotions as a phenomenon in time, we can get completely wrapped up in absurdity, sadness, and despair. And in my example, it took me a long time to see, you know, years even, how to separate my true self out from the overwhelm of my feelings. But when I did, you know, not by my own work, but by simply going through the process of surrendering to my own inability to make sense of what was happening to me, what emerged was a self that could hold the tyranny of my emotion in a compassionate and loving place. And I say this not to say that I've arrived, but to say that what happens is we get a feel for this process, and then, as Jim Finley says, we learn to keep falling like a stone in water, down, down, down into the infinite love of God. There is no arriving, there is only the falling. And so we get a feel for this process, and if we do, it teaches us a pedagogy of attending to our inner lives. We have to run into the complete and utter failure of our ability to make sense of our thoughts and make sense of our emotions in any rational way. And it is in that failure that another way is invited of us, and the true self begins to emerge. So this doesn't mean we completely detach from any emotion altogether. It actually means our emotional intelligence grows because as we begin to separate our true self out from conflating it with our emotions, it actually helps us to understand our emotions a bit better. In Travis Bradberry and Jean Greaves' book, Emotional Intelligence, there are many amazing strategies to grow our emotional intelligence. And to me, each of these is actually a contemplative exercise. So it's things like quit treating your feelings as good or bad. It's things like learn to observe the ripple effect from your emotions and how they flow through your mind and your body. Another one is lean into your discomfort. You know, find those places you feel uncomfortable and lean in. Another one is feel your emotions physically. Let those feelings just, you know, come to be. Another one is don't be fooled by a good or bad mood. You know, so if you feel joyful, that's great. Know that it will pass. If you feel sad or grief-stricken, know that that will pass. You know, don't expect either of them to stay forever. And lastly, you know, another one is get to know yourself under stress. How do you respond? What are your default emotions? What are your default reactivities? So to be sure, we could do a week on each of these encouragements, could we not? Like we could do an entire series on this. But the point is, similar to our thoughts, transcending emotions isn't about repressing or denying them, which many of us often learn to do with certain ones, specific emotions in particular in our families of origin. And it isn't about overindulging them to the point where we get so wrapped up in our feelings and emotions that they overwhelm us and overtake us to the point of shifting our behaviors toward ourselves and others from a compassionate response to a reactive response. There's an old Zen proverb that says, "Get too close to my fire, you burn to death. Get too far away, you freeze to death." This is how we should treat our emotions. So the point is to find a compassionate mode of engagement within ourselves where we can be consciously aware of our emotions and let them run their courses, let them arise and fall. It's actually about getting to know ourselves better, knowing our tendencies, knowing our habits, knowing the usual ways our bodies respond to the stimuli of life. So Bradbury and Greaves say that what happens is that we begin to learn to watch ourselves like a hawk, taking notice of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors right in the situation as the situation unfolds. And again, not judging them as good or bad, but just allowing. A hawk has a bird's eye view. It's like we can zoom out and kind of see it happening in real time. And as, we tend to them, as time passes, we actually become more able to not let our emotions control our behavior in terms of reactivity. Again, nobody does this perfectly. I still have outbursts, right? Everyone has outbursts. But the point is catching a vision for this process of allowing our emotions to arrive and pass. If you remember last week, I said that a good mantra for this series of conversations is every thought will pass. Every emotion will pass. Every feeling will pass. And I said that because once we can recognize that we aren't our thoughts and we aren't our emotions, we can let them be what they are, phenomena that will come and go. And again, there's an inner awareness that's the container for all these comings and goings. Richard Rohr writes about the stages of spiritual growth, and at levels 3 and 4 and 5, he talks about how we can get confused that our thoughts, emotions, and deeper intuitions are who we are. You see, for Rohr, as for John O'Donohue, who said that spirituality is the art of homecoming, the spiritual journey is all about identity, the highest realization of which is I am who I am. It's just me with all my comings and goings. But the me that is invited of us is a me that is no longer rooted in an ego that tries to control the data of our thoughts and emotions. It's a me that is rooted in the true self, in a second naivete. Because again here, the goal of all of this is to enter the second naivete, to recognize that there is an identity, an inner childlikeness beneath your emotions that includes and transcends them all. So the point of this invitation to attend to our inner lives, including our emotions, is to become a safe home for all of our emotions. Because they're not good or bad, they just are. And they all need a conduit who welcomes them to flow freely through us. And if we do this, it will root us in a sense of awe and wonder at the mystery of ourselves. And it will teach us not to let them have power over us, but rather to move through us like currents in a vast ocean. Okay, let's talk about this. Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast. Go to www.waycollective.org or follow us on Instagram at @WayCollective. Peace and every good, y'all.